he told himself. Just drop the box and leave. Don't ring the bell. Don't wait. A black man raising his daughter alone has no business standing on a rich woman's porch in a neighborhood like this. But she opened the door barely covered, hair undone, and looked at him like he was the only real thing she'd seen in weeks. He knew he should walk away. He stepped inside instead. Before we go any further, if you're already hooked on this story, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from. And if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, you'll want to stay for this one. That morning, before any of it happened, Daniel stood in the narrow kitchen of his apartment with a comb in one hand and a hair tie in the other, trying to get his daughter's braids even. Zoe sat on the counter, swinging her legs, patient the way only a 6-year-old who had trained her father could be. "You're pulling too hard," she said. "I'm barely touching you." "That's what you always say." She tilted her head to help him reach the left side. It was a small mercy she'd learned to offer without being asked. Daniel finished the braid, not perfect, slightly uneven at the back, but solid. He'd gotten better over the past 2 years. When Denise first left, he couldn't even do a ponytail without it falling apart by lunchtime. Now he could manage 2 French braids, a twist out, and on a good day, something that almost looked like cornrows. Almost. He set a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her and poured a glass of orange juice. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, like the kind of place where you could hear the neighbor's television through the wall. But it was theirs. He'd made sure of that when the divorce was finalized. No matter what else he lost, Zoe would have a home that didn't move. "Where are you going?" Zoe asked, watching him grab his keys and the cardboard box by the door. "I have to drop something off at my boss's house." Zoe chewed her eggs slowly, thinking, "Is your boss mean?" Daniel almost smiled. "No, she's my boss." "That doesn't answer my question," Zoe said, and Daniel realized she was right. He kissed her on the forehead, told Mrs. Patterson next door that he'd be back in an hour, and carried the box to his truck. The drive from his side of the city to Carolyn Ashford's neighborhood took 22 minutes, but it felt like crossing into another country. And the streets got wider, the lawns got greener, the houses stopped sharing walls and started sitting behind gates and hedges, each one saying the same thing in its own architectural language. "You don't belong here." Daniel had been in the military for 6 years before coming home and taking the junior position at Whitmore and Strauss Design Group. He'd learned to walk into rooms that weren't built for him. He'd learned to keep his face neutral, his voice steady, his hands visible. That training was useful in more places than he'd expected. Carolyn's house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, a 2-story colonial with navy shutters and a front garden that someone was paid to maintain. Daniel had never been here before. At the office, Carolyn Ashford was sharp lines and measured words. The kind of woman who could end a meeting with a single sentence and make everyone thank her for it. She ran the creative division with a precision that left no room for small talk. Daniel respected her. Everyone did. But respect and warmth were different things, and no one at Whitmore and Strauss would have described Carolyn as warm. The box in his hands contained fabric samples and a portfolio she'd left at the office before her medical leave. Something with her back or shoulder, the details kept vague by HR. He was supposed to courier it. Instead, his supervisor had asked if he could just swing by since it's on his way. It wasn't on his way. It was never on his way. But he said yes because that was what Daniel Mercer did. He said yes to the things that weren't his job. Because saying no meant giving someone a reason to question whether he deserved to be there at all. He parked on the street rather than in the driveway, carried the box up the stone path, rang the doorbell once and stepped back, giving space. He planned to hand it over, say something professional, and be back in his truck in under 2 minutes. That was the plan. The plan lasted exactly 11 seconds. The door opened and Carolyn Ashford stood in front of him looking nothing like the woman he knew. No blazer, no heels, no armor. Just an oversized t-shirt that hung past her thighs, bare legs, her hair loose and unwashed around her shoulders. She looked smaller than she did in the office. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. And she looked at him, not the way a boss looks at an employee who's delivering her things. She looked at him the way someone looks at an unexpected voice in a house that's been too quiet for too long. Daniel. She said his name like she was confirming he was real. Ms. Ashford, I have your portfolio and the samples from the Morrison project. I can just leave them. Come in, she said. Not a command. Not quite a request either. Something in between. Something that carried the weight of a woman who hadn't spoken to another person face to face in longer than she wanted to admit. Every instinct Daniel had built over 33 years told him to set the box down and walk away. This was his boss's home. She was barely dressed. He was a black man standing on her porch in a neighborhood where someone had probably already noticed his truck. The math wasn't complicated, but there was something in her voice. I'm not need. Carolyn Ashford didn't do need, at least not in any way she'd let you see. It was more like an opening, a crack in something that had been sealed shut for a long time, and she had made the choice to open that door knowing exactly how she looked. That wasn't carelessness. That was a decision. He stepped inside. The house was exactly what he expected. High ceilings, hardwood floors, furniture that looked like it belonged in a catalog. Everything in its place, everything curated, and underneath all of it, a silence so thick he could feel it pressing against his skin. A radio played softly from the kitchen, some jazz station turned down low. Not for enjoyment, he realized, for company. Carolyn led him through the foyer to the kitchen island, where she gestured for him to set the box down. She moved carefully, one hand drifting to her left shoulder in a way that told Daniel her injury was worse than she let on. Thank you for bringing these, she said. I know this wasn't part of your job description. Most of what I do isn't part of my job description, Daniel said. He hadn't meant it to sound bitter. It just came out true. Carolyn studied him for a moment, then something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the recognition that he'd said something she understood. She turned toward the coffee machine on the counter, a high-end Italian model that looked like it cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. She pressed a button. Nothing happened. She pressed it again, harder, as if force would fix whatever was broken. This thing hasn't worked in 11 months, she said. I'm staring at it with the quiet frustration of someone who had simply accepted that certain things in her life would remain broken. Daniel set his keys down. Can I take a look? She stepped aside. He opened the back panel, checked the water line, found the valve that had gotten clogged with calcium buildup. It wasn't complicated, just the kind of thing that needed someone to actually look at it instead of assuming it was beyond repair. He cleared the line, reassembled the panel, and hit the button. The machine hummed to life. 30 seconds later, the smell of fresh espresso filled the kitchen. Carolyn watched the dark liquid pour into the cup like she was witnessing something she'd stopped believing was possible. She wrapped both hands around the cup and took a sip, and for just a second, her eyes closed. When she opened them, she wasn't looking at the coffee anymore. She was looking at him, not at a junior designer, not at the guy from the office who'd been sent to deliver her things. She was looking at him the way you look at someone who just fixed something you'd given up on. And Daniel felt it. That shift in the air between them, the moment when a professional interaction becomes something else. Something without a name yet, but with enough gravity to change the direction of everything that follows. He should have left then. The coffee was made, the box was delivered, there was no reason to stay, but his eyes caught something in the living room. A tall wooden bookshelf against the far wall, fully loaded, leaning at an angle that made his stomach drop. The brackets on the top were pulling away from the drywall. Now one of the middle shelves was bowed under the weight of hardcovers. The whole thing was a collapse waiting to happen. How long has that been like that? He asked, nodding toward it. Carolyn glanced over. A while. I keep meaning to call someone. That's not a call someone next week situation. That's a this could come down tonight situation. Daniel walked over and tested the frame with one hand. The top bracket shifted under minimal pressure. If this fell, on anyone, but especially on a woman already dealing with a shoulder injury, the damage could be serious. He looked back at her. I can come back and anchor this properly, if you want. Carolyn leaned against the kitchen island, holding her coffee with both hands, watching him, and he could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. The same sharpness she brought to every decision at the office. The risk assessment, the cost-benefit analysis. Letting a subordinate into her home once was an irregularity. Letting him come back was a pattern. Saturday, she said. I'll be here. Daniel nodded. He picked up his keys from the counter. On his way to the door, he passed the radio, still murmuring its low jazz into the empty room. He almost said something about it, about how the music sounded less like something she was listening to and more like something she was hiding behind. But he didn't. Some things you notice and keep to yourself, at least the first time. He drove home under a sky that couldn't decide between sun and clouds. Mrs. Patterson was watching a game show in his living room when he walked in. Zoe was on the floor with her coloring book, tongue poking out in concentration. Was your boss mean? Zoe asked without looking up. Daniel hung his keys on the hook by the door. He thought about Carolyn standing in that doorway, barefoot, holding her coffee, choosing to say Saturday instead of thank you. That won't be necessary. No, he said. She wasn't mean. Zoe looked up then, studying his face with those dark eyes that missed nothing. You look weird. I look fine. You look like when you eat something spicy and you're pretending it doesn't burn. Daniel sat down next to her and picked up a blue crayon. What are we coloring? A castle, Zoe said, with a really big door. He looked at the drawing, a lopsided castle with windows that didn't match, and a door that took up half the front wall. A door big enough for anyone to walk through. He started coloring and didn't say anything else. But his mind was already on Saturday, already in that house, already past a line he hadn't yet crossed but could feel pulling at him like a current beneath still water. Saturday came, and Daniel showed up at Carolyn's door with a drill, a stud finder, and a bag of heavy-duty wall anchors. She opened the door fully dressed this time, jeans, a soft gray sweater, but her feet were still bare, and the radio was still on. He spent 3 hours on the bookshelf, pulled it away from the wall, patched the holes where the old brackets had torn through the drywall, found the studs, and mounted everything properly. Carolyn didn't hover, but she didn't disappear either. She sat in the armchair across the room with a book open on her lap, turning pages occasionally, though Daniel suspected she wasn't reading much. Every now and then she'd ask him something. About the tools, about the house, about how he'd learned to do this kind of work. My father, Daniel said, tightening the last bracket. He built furniture in our garage. Chairs mostly. He believed if a man couldn't fix what was broken in his own house, he had no business living in one. Carolyn considered this. And if a woman can't fix what's broken in hers? Then maybe she lets someone help, or maybe she learns. Either way, the shelf shouldn't fall on her head while she's figuring it out. Something close to a laugh escaped Carolyn. Brief, almost reluctant, as if her body remembered the motion but hadn't practiced it in a long time. She made coffee with the machine he'd repaired, and this time she poured 2 cups without asking whether he wanted one. They sat at the kitchen island and talked, not about work, not about the bookshelf, about the things that people only discuss when they're alone in a quiet house and the usual scripts don't apply. Daniel told her about Zoe. Not the cute anecdotes, but the real weight of it. The mornings when he braided her hair, knowing full well the other mothers at school would redo it the moment he left. The parent-teacher conferences where every question was directed at finding out where Zoe's mother was, as though a black father sitting alone in that chair was evidence of something missing rather than someone showing up. The caseworker during the custody process who'd asked him, without any trace of irony, whether he had a female support system in place for the child's emotional development, as if love required a specific anatomy to function. Carolyn listened without interrupting. When he finished, she didn't offer comfort or solutions. She offered something harder: honesty. "I built this career so I'd never have to depend on anyone," she said, looking around the kitchen as if seeing it through someone else's eyes. "No husband to leave me, no partner to disappoint me. I made myself into someone who didn't need anything from anyone." She traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger. But somewhere along the way, not needing anyone turned into not having anyone. And I told myself that was the same as strength. It's not. It's just a different kind of hiding. Neither of them moved to fill the silence that followed. But the radio murmured from the counter. Not music anymore, just the low hum of a voice reading the afternoon forecast to an audience of empty chairs. He left that afternoon with a list of other small repairs he'd noticed: a loose cabinet hinge, a window that didn't seal properly, a crack running along the baseboard in the hallway. He didn't offer to fix them. He didn't have to. The following Saturday he was back, and the Saturday after that. Each visit built something neither of them named. Conversations got longer. Coffee became a ritual rather than a courtesy. Daniel learned that Carolyn read architecture books for pleasure, that she hated cooking but loved the idea of it, that she kept the thermostat 2 degrees colder than comfortable because she believed warmth made people lazy. Carolyn learned that Daniel could build almost anything with his hands, but had never finished the rocking chair his father started before he died, that he listened to old soul records when Zoe was asleep, that he'd served 2 tours and came home to a wife who'd already started packing. None of this was safe. Both of them knew it. One Tuesday evening, after his 3rd Saturday at her house, Daniel came home to find Zoe already in her pajamas, sitting cross-legged on the couch with Mrs. Patterson watching a nature documentary about elephants. "Baby elephants hold their mama's tail so they don't get lost," Zoe announced when he walked in. Daniel thanked Mrs. Patterson, locked the door, and sat down next to his daughter. She leaned into him automatically, the way she always did, her small body fitting against his side like a key into a lock. Dad?" Her voice was softer now, almost sleepy. "Yeah? You're happier. Like, your face is different." Daniel looked down at her. "What do you mean, different?" Zoe scrunched her nose, thinking. "Like when you used to look at the picture of Grandpa and smile, but also look sad. Now you just smile, but bigger." He didn't know how to answer that. His 6-year-old had noticed a change in him before he'd fully admitted it to himself. He kissed the top of her head and told her it was bedtime. But long after she fell asleep, he sat in the living room staring at the chair he'd never finished, his father's last project, still just a skeleton of curved wood and unfulfilled intention, and thought about what it meant that his daughter could read him better than he could read himself. The phone call came on a Wednesday, right when Daniel was heating up leftover pasta for dinner. Denise's name on the screen felt like a hand reaching out from a closed chapter. They'd been civil since the divorce, cordial, even, keeping things functional for Zoe's sake. She called on birthdays and holidays, showed up for her scheduled weekends when she remembered, sent gifts that were always a little too expensive, as if price could compensate for presents. But this call felt different before he even answered. Something about the hour, or maybe just the instinct of a man who'd once known this woman well enough to marry her. "I've been thinking," Denise said, skipping the small talk entirely. "About us. About Zoe. She needs a real family, Daniel. A full home. I know I haven't been perfect, but I'm ready now. I've changed." Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the pasta rotate in the microwave. "Denise, just hear me out. Everyone says kids do better with both parents. Your mother says it. My mother says it. The therapist I've been seeing says consistency matters, and what's more consistent than a family under one roof? He could feel the weight of it. Not just her words, but the entire machinery of expectation behind them. Every sermon about keeping families together. Every sideways glance from relatives who believed a man raising a girl alone was a temporary arrangement waiting for a woman to correct it. Every article, every statistic, every well-meaning stranger who saw Zoe's hair slightly uneven and assumed she was missing something essential. A year ago, he might have said yes. Not out of love, but out of fear. Fear that Zoe would grow up and ask why he didn't try harder. At fear that the world would look at him and see a man who failed at the one thing society told him to hold together. But something had shifted. Not because of Carolyn, he wouldn't let himself believe that, but because in the past few weeks, he'd seen what it looked like to live inside a beautiful house that was really just an elegant cage. Carolyn had everything Denise was promising: stability, structure, a home that looked right from the outside, and she was the loneliest person he'd ever met. "I'll always be Zoe's father," Daniel said, his voice steady and without anger. "That doesn't change. But I'm not coming back to a marriage we both know was already over before you walked out. I won't teach my daughter that a family means two people pretending." The silence on the other end was sharp, at the kind that comes right before things either heal or break for good. "You're making a mistake," Denise said quietly. Then she hung up. Daniel set the phone on the counter and took the pasta out of the microwave. His hands were steady. His chest was not. But for the first time in a long time, the decision didn't feel like sacrifice. It felt like the truth. 3 weeks into his Saturdays at Carolyn's house, a silver Audi pulled into the driveway while Daniel was replacing the weathered caulk around the kitchen window. He saw it through the glass, sleek, polished, deliberate. The man who stepped out wore the kind of casual clothes that cost more than formal wear, and he walked toward the front door like he still had a key: Graham Whitfield. Daniel didn't know the name yet, but he recognized the type. The posture, said the ownership in the stride, the way his eyes swept the property like he was calculating its value and his share of it. Carolyn answered the door, and Daniel could hear the shift in her voice from the kitchen, tighter, controlled, the professional mask snapping back into place. "Graham, you didn't call." "Since when do I need to call?" Graham stepped inside and stopped when he saw Daniel standing by the window with a caulk gun. The two men measured each other in the way men do when words haven't started yet, but the conversation is already happening. "Who's this?" Graham's tone was casual. His eyes were not. "Daniel works at the firm," Carolyn said. He's been helping me with some repairs while I'm recovering." Graham's gaze moved from Daniel's work boots to the tools on the counter to the 2 coffee cups sitting side by side near the sink. He smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't a smile at all. "That's thoughtful. Company really goes above and beyond for its directors these days." Daniel said nothing. He'd spent 6 years in the Army learning when silence was the most powerful response available. After Daniel left that afternoon, Carolyn called him. She told him Graham was someone she'd been involved with for 2 years, a man from her world, her tax bracket, her social circle. A man who'd been good to her in the ways he understood: expensive dinners, vacations, introductions to the right people. But his version of care came with conditions. He gave generously, and as long as he got to decide what she needed. He protected fiercely, as long as she agreed on what she needed protecting from. When Carolyn ended it, Graham hadn't argued. He'd simply refused to believe it was permanent. "He's not a bad person," Carolyn said. "He just can't imagine that what he offers isn't enough." Daniel understood more than she knew. Graham wasn't just an ex. He was a mirror, a man so invested in the version of Carolyn he'd constructed that the real one had become invisible to him. The office whispers started the following week. Nothing loud, nothing direct, just the particular frequency of gossip that hums through a workplace when people suspect something they can't prove. Glances in the break room, conversations that stopped when Daniel walked past. A colleague asking, a little too casually, how he'd been spending his weekends. Daniel ran the numbers in his head the way he always did, cold, practical. If this continued, someone would file an informal complaint. HR would step in. The power dynamic between a junior designer and the creative director was clear enough that no explanation would sound innocent, even if every word of it was true. He'd be the one reassigned, or let go. And in either case, the narrative would write itself. Black employee, white female boss, inappropriate relationship. The story would be sealed before he could open his mouth. He started looking at the internal job board. There was an opening in the commercial division. Different floor, different reporting structure, slightly less interesting work, but completely outside Carolyn's chain of command. It would mean starting over in a department where no one knew him. It would mean giving up the position he'd spent 2 years fighting to earn. But it would also mean that whatever existed between him and Carolyn, whatever this unnamed thing was, couldn't be weaponized against either of them. He hadn't told Carolyn yet. He wasn't sure how. Then Graham came to his apartment. It was a Thursday evening. Zoe was at a friend's house for a play date. Daniel was sanding the frame of his father's unfinished rocking chair when the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find Graham standing in the hallway of his apartment building. Tailored jacket, expensive watch, looking at the scuffed walls and flickering hallway light with an expression that said everything his mouth hadn't yet. "I wanted to talk," Graham said. "Man to man." "Then talk." Daniel didn't step aside, didn't invite him in. Graham glanced past him into the apartment, the small living room, the coloring books on the floor, the skeleton of the rocking chair in the corner. "You seem like a decent guy, Daniel. I'm not here to start anything. I just want to understand what you think is happening with Carolyn. I think that's between me and her." "See? That's where we disagree." Graham's voice stayed even, almost friendly. "Carolyn she's the kind of woman who takes in projects. She fixes things. She sees something broken and she can't help herself. I'm just wondering if maybe you're the latest project." Daniel held the door frame with one hand. "Are you done?" "Almost." Graham looked at him with something that wasn't quite contempt but wasn't respect either. Something closer to pity, which was worse. "I gave that woman 2 years. 2 years of everything. Trips, dinners, connections she wouldn't have had without me. And she still walked away. So what exactly are you offering that I didn't? A caulk gun and good intentions." Daniel stared at him for a long moment. "I think you should leave." Graham straightened his jacket. "Think about what I said. For her sake, if not yours." After he left, Daniel stood in the doorway for a long time. The hallway smelled like someone else's dinner. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, and he felt, for the first time, the full weight of what he was walking into. Not just the distance between his world and Carolyn's, but the fact that people on both sides would line up to tell him it was too far to cross. The second blow came 2 days later. Denise called again, and this time her voice was different. Not pleading, not soft, tactical. "I've been talking to my lawyer," she said, "about the custody arrangement. If you're going to be bringing new people into Zoe's life, people you work for, people in a completely different world from her, I need to know my daughter is in a stable environment." The threat wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. Denise was framing his relationship with Carolyn as evidence of instability, a single father so distracted by his boss that his judgment couldn't be trusted. Daniel hung up and sat on the edge of his bed with his hands pressed together, running through every possible outcome. Losing Zoe was not an option. It had never been an option. Everything he'd built since the divorce, the apartment, the job, the routine, the braids he'd taught himself at 2 in the morning watching tutorial videos, all of it was scaffolding around one simple truth. Zoe was his, and he was hers, and nothing in the world was worth risking that. His phone rang again. This time it was Carolyn. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the authority it carried at the office. "Daniel, I need to say something, and I need you to listen before you respond." He waited. "Something's changed with you these past few days. I can hear it every time we talk. And I don't need you to explain it, but I need you to know that I've been thinking." She took a breath that he could hear shaking slightly on the other end. "I don't want to be the reason you lose your daughter. If this, whatever this is between us, if it puts Zoe at risk, then I'll be the one to walk away. That's my choice, not yours, mine." Daniel closed his eyes. He could hear it in her voice, the same mechanism he knew so well in himself. The preemptive retreat, the pulling back before you can be pushed. Carolyn wasn't being selfless. She was being afraid. She was doing exactly what she'd done her entire adult life, building a wall and calling it protection, choosing loneliness before someone else could choose it for her. And he recognized it because he'd done the same thing every single day since Denise walked out, kept his head down, stayed in his lane, never reached for anything that might be taken away. "Carolyn," he said, "don't. Don't what? Don't make this decision for me. Don't decide what I can and can't handle. I've had enough people in my life telling me what's too much for me." The line went quiet. In the background of her house, he could hear the faint murmur of the radio, still playing, still filling rooms that no one else occupied. "Then what do we do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Daniel said, "but we don't do it by running." He hung up and looked at the rocking chair frame across the room. Half-built, waiting. His father had died before finishing it, and Daniel had carried it from apartment to apartment for years, telling himself he'd complete it someday when he had the right tools, someday when he had the time, someday when finishing it didn't feel like admitting his father was really gone. He picked up the sandpaper and went back to work. On Monday morning, Daniel walked into the HR office at Whitmore and Strauss and submitted his transfer request to the commercial division. The woman behind the desk, a redhead named Janet, who'd processed his original hire 2 years ago, looked at the form and then looked at him. "You sure about this? You've built a solid track record in creative. Starting over in commercial means new team, new metrics, new everything." "I'm sure," Daniel said. Janet studied him for a moment longer, then stamped the form. "Effective in 2 weeks. You'll report to David Marsh on the 4th floor." He thanked her and left. Walking back through the creative division felt different already. The desks, the mood boards on the walls, the hum of conversations he'd spent 2 years learning to navigate. And he'd earned his place here by being twice as good and half as loud as anyone around him. Leaving wasn't failure. It was the cost of building something that mattered more than a title on a door. That evening, he called Denise. "I need you to hear me clearly," he said, standing in the kitchen while Zoe watched cartoons in the living room. "I am Zoe's father. I have been her father every single day since you decided you weren't ready to be her mother. I braid her hair. I make her breakfast. I sit in those little chairs at parent-teacher night. I know her favorite color changes every 2 weeks, and right now it's purple. I know she's afraid of thunderstorms, but won't admit it because she thinks it'll make me worry." He kept his voice low, not out of anger, but out of clarity. "You can call your lawyer. You can call whoever you want. But you will not use our daughter as leverage to punish me for moving forward with my life. That's not parenting. That's control." Denise was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, the edge was gone from her voice, replaced by something more tired than hostile. "I just don't want her to get hurt." "Neither do I," Daniel said. "That's the one thing we still agree on." He hung up and looked at Zoe through the doorway. She was lying on her stomach, feet kicking in the air, laughing at something on the screen. She had no idea that people were drawing battle lines around her. He intended to keep it that way. Across the city, in the house on the cul-de-sac, Carolyn was having a different conversation. Graham had come without calling again. His usual move, showing up as though his presence was a gift that required no invitation. He stood in the foyer with his hands in his pockets, looking around the room the way he always did, cataloging everything, measuring whether the space still reflected the woman he thought he knew. "I'm not here to argue," Graham said. "I just want to understand what's happening with you." Carolyn stood across from him, arms folded, not defensively, deliberately. "What's happening is that I made a choice. The same choice I made 6 months ago when I ended things between us. The fact that you keep showing up doesn't change the choice, Graham. It just tells me you weren't listening the first time." Graham's jaw tightened. "This is about him, isn't it? The guy with the tool belt?" "This is about me." Carolyn's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You were good to me. I know that. You gave me things most people would be grateful for. But you were good to the version of me you wanted. The one who showed up at your events, who fit into your plans, who made sense next to you at a dinner table. You never asked what I actually needed. You just decided." Graham stared at her. And for the first time since Daniel had seen him pull into the driveway in that silver Audi, the armor cracked. Not dramatically, not with shouting or accusations. Just a quiet fracture across the face of a man who was beginning to understand that generosity without curiosity isn't love, it's decoration. "So that's it," he said. Not a question. "That's it." Graham looked around the foyer one last time. At the hardwood floors, the high ceilings, the house he'd once imagined himself settling into. Then he looked back at Carolyn, nodded once. A small, almost imperceptible gesture that carried more dignity than anything he'd said in weeks, and walked out. The front door closed behind him without a sound. Carolyn stood alone in the hallway. The radio was playing from the kitchen, that jazz station still doing the only job it had ever been given in this house, pretending someone was home. She walked over to the counter, looked at the small black speaker, and turned it off. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was open, like a room that had finally been cleared of furniture that no one was using. 2 Saturdays later, Daniel pulled into Carolyn's driveway with something large wrapped in moving blankets strapped to the bed of his truck, and in the passenger seat, buckled in tight with her legs barely reaching the edge of the cushion, sat Zoe. She'd asked to come. Now, not because she understood what was happening between her father and the woman whose house he'd been visiting, but because Daniel had mentioned there was a big house with a lot of rooms, and Zoe had decided that any house with a lot of rooms probably had interesting things to look at. Carolyn opened the front door and saw the little girl first. Zoe stood on the porch in a yellow sundress with her braids pinned up, Daniel's best work, looking at the house with wide, unguarded eyes. No judgment, no measuring. Just the raw curiosity of a child encountering something new and finding it wonderful. "Hi," Zoe said. "I'm Zoe. Your house is really big." Carolyn crouched down to her level. "Hi, Zoe. It is big, isn't it?" Zoe tilted her head, examining Carolyn with the same directness she used on everything. "How many rooms do you have?" 7, I think. Maybe 8 if you count the sunroom." Zoe's eyes went wide. "Do you live here all by yourself?" The question landed exactly where a child's question always lands, in the place adults have learned to protect. Carolyn's expression shifted, just barely, a flicker of something raw moving across her features before she steadied herself. "I do," she said. "For now." Zoe considered this with 6-year-old gravity. "That's a lot of rooms for one person. You could fit a whole family in here." Carolyn looked up at Daniel, who was standing behind his daughter with the wrapped bundle balanced against his hip. He met her eyes, and what passed between them wasn't a plan or a promise. It was an acknowledgement, and that this child, with her lopsided braids and her fearless honesty, and had just said the truest thing anyone had said in this house in years. Daniel carried the bundle inside and unwrapped it in the living room, near the bookshelf he'd anchored months ago. It was the rocking chair. Finished. The curved wood his father had shaped years ago. now sanded smooth, stained a deep walnut, assembled with joints tight enough to last a generation. The seat was wide, the back was high. It was the kind of chair built not for decoration, but for use. For reading, for holding a child, for sitting in silence at the end of a long day and feeling the weight of everything that matters. He set it by the window where the afternoon light came in strongest. It looked like it had always been there. Carolyn ran her hand along the armrest, feeling the grain under her fingertips. She didn't ask about his father. She didn't need to, or she understood what it meant to finish something that someone you loved had started, and what it meant to place it in a home you were choosing to be part of, rather than the one you were trying to survive. Zoe, meanwhile, had already made herself at home. She'd found the sunroom and was sitting cross-legged on the floor with a book she'd pulled from the newly secured bookshelf, reading aloud to herself in the half-whisper of a child who was still learning which words needed to be spoken and which could stay on the page. The house held all three of them without strain. The ceilings were still high, the floors were still polished, but the silence that had lived here for years, the kind that gets into walls and stays, was gone, replaced by the specific, unrepeatable sound of people breathing in the same space. On a morning not long after, Carolyn stood in her kitchen and made coffee, not with hesitation, not with the frustrated button pressing of a woman fighting a broken machine. She filled the reservoir, set the cup, pressed the button, and the Italian machine, the one that had sat dead on her counter for 11 months before a man she barely knew cleared a calcium valve and brought it back to life, hummed without complaint. The espresso poured dark and steady into the cup. She drank it standing up, looking out the kitchen window at the street where Daniel's truck was parked in the driveway. Not on the street, in the driveway. In the living room, Zoe was curled in the rocking chair with her book, the chair moving in a slow, lazy rhythm as she turned pages. The morning light caught the walnut stain and made the wood glow warm. That Daniel came through the front door without knocking. No box in his hands, no tools, no excuse. He walked in the way a person walks into a place where they are expected, where their coffee cup is already sitting on the counter, where a child's shoes are already by the door, where the sounds of the house include them. He sat down at the kitchen island. Carolyn set the second cup in front of him. Their fingers touched on the handle briefly, and neither pulled away. The radio on the counter was off. It had been off for weeks now. The rooms that had once needed a stranger's voice just to feel less hollow were now full on their own. Footsteps. Laughter. The creak of a rocking chair. The voice of a little girl reading out loud. The house was no longer empty. And Daniel Mercer was no longer just passing through. See, sometimes the person who changes your life doesn't come to save you. They just open the door and let you walk in. And that's where we'll leave them, in a house that finally feels like home. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from. We love hearing from all of you around the world. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe. We've got more stories like this coming soon.